This video is about autonomy, automata, and mechanisms. What it means to be autonomous versus to be automated, and how this distinction might impinge on our characterization of AI systems as one or the other. We will also explore some of the classic conceptions of autonomy and automata and the philosophical traditions from which much of current discourse on autonomous artificial beings draws its ideas, biases, and critiques. Not all instances of technologies taken to be cases of automation are taken to be autonomous. An autonomous robot would be one whose behavior, movement, decision processes, recognition tasks, language processing, whatever it does, are accomplished on board without the help of interventions from human beings. On the other hand, automated telemarketing calls are automated, but not autonomous. So we can perhaps say that autonomous mechanisms are a subset of automations. Perhaps, if we take something to be autonomous, then we regard its processes, functions, or behavior as automatic or automated. And yet, this might not sit right with you, perhaps for the following reason. Human beings are taken to be autonomous. Autonomy, in one respect or another, is usually taken to be essential to humanity and an axis about which human rights, among other things, are taken to turn. But are the processes, functions, and behaviors of autonomous humans automations? Perhaps it would help to get some etymology out of the way. Autonomy has its roots in the Greek prefix autos, which means self, and nomos, which means law or custom. Thus, we can, in a most literal sense, characterize autonomy as self-governing. And indeed, looking at a very close Greek cognate, autonomia, which means independence, we can perhaps for now be satisfied with this definition. Modern use of the term typically insinuates independence, freedom, self-governance, and self-determination in uses of the word, so for now, we can leave it at that. On the other hand, automaton has a rather suggestive and perhaps surprising etymological roots. Once again, we see the prefix autos, but matos, the Greek root meaning thinking, willing, or animated, is perhaps at odds with our intuitions about automata, automation, and automatic processes. Typically, the literature draws a distinction precisely between automata and that which is thinking, willing, desiring, believing, and so on. In other words, the common use of the term supposes that to be an automaton is precisely not to think, will, or be animated. For the record, it's perhaps also worth noting here that animated likely ought to be construed in the Latin sense of having life, breath, or even spirit, a word used sometimes to distinguish the spirited from the inert. While we will avoid getting bogged down in the precise semantics of the word, we can at the very least observe that automata has a history of being contrasted with thinking beings, rather than being themselves thinking beings. There is perhaps no better place to observe this distinction between automata and thinking beings than in the writings of our good friend René Descartes. Descartes is known for his dualism, drawing a strict distinction between mind and material and holding that human beings are a unique blend of the two, while animals, plants, rocks, dirt, and, well, everything else is just matter. In the material world, Descartes could observe that everything was simply cause and effect. If X happens, Y follows, and that's all. But for human beings, Descartes argued, it was thanks to the substance of mind that we could avoid this deterministic monotony, that we could have free will, that we could be autonomos, self-governing. However, to Descartes' 17th century eye, there was a remaining issue. While he could see the direct causal machinations of For example, water-powered mills and hammering nails, kicking rocks and tying knots, he noticed that some things in his matter-only category had no apparent outward cause for their movement, functions, and behavior. Things like clocks, but also like animals. These Descartes characterized as automatons, self-moving but still just inert, unanimated material machines. It is this philosophical legacy, a kind of philosophical mechanicism, from which we likely derive our intuitions about automatons, autonomy, and mechanisms. Autonomy is about freedom and independence, while automatons are determined, subject to the relentless causal hum of their machinations. So let's now try to make some of these ideas a bit more precise. We can see that Descartes distinguishes between mind-having humans and mere automata like clocks and animals, but he drew a further distinction between mechanisms and automata. Mechanisms were wholly determined collections of parts, the parts causally linked, one part affecting another to cause it to move or function in some other way. You can think of exciting a current or releasing a gamma ray for more modern examples. In mechanisms, it was easy to see the entire causal chain of parts from start to finish of the extended system. By contrast, automata were taken to be self-moving mechanisms. A mechanism with causally linked parts, but whatever gets it going is also within the system itself. Perhaps not always obvious, but for Descartes, definitely still material, determined, and unfree. If we adopt 17th century Cartesian dualism, this is how we make a distinction between automata and non, by focusing on the kinds of things that might get an automata going, and whatever special non-mechanistic things get human beings going. For 17th century Cartesians, this special thing was the mind. What's important to notice here is that this kind of dualism locates agency, and maybe we could say true autonomy, in having a mind. Human beings were free precisely insofar as their movements and behaviors originated somewhere other than the mechanistic chugging along of material cause and effect. By and large, our current epoch has eschewed Cartesian dualism. We don't typically posit untestable, undetectable, non-material substrates as part of our ontology, particularly not the modern scientific ontology. Still, that's not to say the legacy of Cartesian dualism has wholly disappeared. It lurks in our intuitions about Alexa and Siri, food delivery robots, and self-driving cars. Intuitions that sometimes tell us that these things lack something that makes us, at the very least, circumspect about attributing them moral status, agency, or cognitive status of certain stripes. While a video tracing all of the various strands of popular intuitions regarding artificial systems would be nigh impossible and require hours of boring slides with bland voiceovers, I do want to draw our attention to one particular facet of this discussion that ties together notions of autonomy, mechanism, and automation. Something that has a close relationship to ideas about mind, and that is knowledge or information. I want to turn our attention to a relationship seeming to undergird modern ascriptions of autonomy, a relationship between independence and information or knowledge. Remember the Kiwi campus robots from the Photomation and Hidden Labor video? The company responsible for them characterizes their nature of relying on both internal programming and help from human supervisors as, quote, parallel autonomy. By this, it seems, they mean that the robots display a certain level of autonomy in their ability to navigate their immediate environment, react to curbs, people, walls, and various obstructions of various kinds. At the same time, the autonomy in parallel with that robot autonomy is presumably that of the human beings in Colombia telling them where to go and how to get there. In this case, we can observe that the human and the robot are using different types of information to do some kind of task. The robot's autonomous behavior is based in informational know-how about navigating its physical environment. The human being's autonomous behavior, in their supervising of the robot, is based in knowing how to get from point A to point B and finding new ways, upon encountering construction or closed roads or sidewalks, to get where the robot needs to go. This idea of use of information is really important here. In philosophical mechanicism and the usually attendant dualism, the focus is on the physical how of movement, functions, and behaviors, separating the purely physical, determined, unfree from the mental, non-physical, and free-willed origins of human behavior. A distinction is made between physical movement that is wholly materially determined and physical movement determined in part by the substance of mind. Those which fall into the former category are automata, the latter not. Here, on the other hand, we can see that the robot's autonomy is predicated on being able to navigate its environment independently. It navigates its environment independently by being able to know how to react to immediate stimuli. More telling is what is happening in parallel. What the robot does not know requires this parallel autonomy of the human being. In particular, we observe that where the robot is not autonomous, it is human beings' knowledge filling the gap. The robot's lack of navigational autonomy is a lack of knowledge of sorts. The human being lends information rather than a helping hand or foot, that is to say, rather than some physical assistance. This is just to say that knowledge, human or otherwise, plays a part in many instances of what is taken to be autonomous behavior. To see what I mean by this, consider again the Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, or Turkers, from the previous video. If we had to give a broad strokes characterization of the kinds of tasks to which programming has so far been inadequate, a broad strokes characterization of what it is that Amazon Mechanical Turk workers do, we could say that it is connecting the thread of reference, doing the work of establishing where, how, and why a particular function, string, or formal element of some sort or other reaches out into the world. What do I mean by this? Well, we can use labeling images as a paradigm example. Machine learning systems can learn what sorts of images might correspond with the string CAT, but only after some worker, perhaps an Amazon Turker, labels countless pictures of cats. Not until someone draws the invisible thread between a string of letters or numbers and an idea or object in the world, not until someone connects the mark of the representation and what is being represented, can the system begin to operate autonomously with this new endowed knowledge about what images have cats in them. Well, what's the point here? This is to say nothing about whether systems can have quote-unquote true autonomy, or be ascribed agency, or minds, or even knowledge per se. But what is worth noting here is that the autonomy of modern systems is not predicated on the ability of self-governance, mind-endowed free will, or even self-movement. It's predicated on having the requisite information to operate in a task without depending on human knowledge-based intervention. Interventions not of a physical and mechanical sort, but of an informational or knowledge sort. What it means to be autonomous is, very loosely speaking, about knowing what's what. We still have some cleaning up to do. Half of this video has been occupied with automata, while the other half has been talking about autonomy. And even then, this discussion of autonomy has been tracking more closely with the way this term is used in the context of AI systems. We have examined a highly influential distinction between automata and human beings, thanks to Cartesian dualism, that has served as a touchpoint for many modern discussions of AI. Now we must more explicitly connect the dots to show just how this idea has made its way into modern discourse on autonomous systems. To reduce it to an almost criminal simplicity, the difference between automata and humans was taken to be predicated upon the possession of a non-material ontological substance, mind. Humans had mind, conceived of as a non-material but totally real force that was the source of free will, belief, desire, and so on. Automata, like animals and clocks, had no mind, were pure material, a special species of mechanism whose causal origins were internal rather than external, but still hopelessly material and therefore hopelessly determined. Automata, in the Cartesian sense, are therefore independent in a certain respect, namely a physical one, not dependent on external causal influences for their motion, operation, processes, or functions. In precisely this respect, we might say automata are autonomous, at least materially so. At the same time, in the Cartesian sense of freedom, of will, of belief, desire, and so on, this is precisely what automata lack. If autonomy is construed as freedom of will, belief, desire, then this is in fact what makes automata automata. They don't have it. So we see that autonomy has at least these two dimensions: a material dimension, being able to self-move, self-cause, and another one, in the Cartesian framework, a mind dimension. But in a modern framework, we can characterize it as a knowledge or informational one. Modern instances of autonomous systems may be ascribed autonomy in one respect, but not in another. Or they may be ascribed autonomy along some specific dimensions of either material or information, while needing help or being dependent in other ways along that same dimension. For example, the Kiwi campus robot is autonomous with respect to a certain subset of know-how, navigating the immediate physical environment, but dependent with respect to another subset of know-how, navigating to specific locations in space and time. To sum this up in as coherent a way as possible, we can identify a highly influential philosophical tradition, Cartesian dualism, which invoked and characterized notions of automata. Automata as mechanisms, as self-moving, and as independent in certain respects. Many of the ways that the notion of automata continues to be used today are to make various distinctions between humans and other things, humans and animals, humans and machines. Whether or not we abandon dualism, to this set of tendencies we can ask, are human beings automata? And if not, in what respect are human beings not automata? Whatever we might think, we need to be aware of the way the very idea of automata is in one way or another an idea conceived in contradistinction to a human being. At the same time, we can observe the close connections between notions of autonomy and humanity. Autonomy's role as a basis for human rights, human agency, and even perhaps moral responsibility. This close connection between humanity and autonomy is borne out in the aforementioned philosophical tradition. Autonomy, construed as freedom and independence of action, desire, belief, thought, and so on, was precisely the purview of the human. To be human was to be autonomous in this way, freely thinking, freely acting, freely believing, desiring, willing, and so on. Aspects of this human versus non-human dichotomy seem to have been preserved even in a post-Cartesian dualist paradigm. We can see remnants of this dichotomy play out in competing conceptions of autonomy. Autonomy as simply self-moving versus autonomy as independence or freedom. Autonomy as simply self-moving is a property of automata. It's what sets automata apart from other mechanisms. Autonomy as freedom or independence of thought, belief, desire, action, will, and so on is a property of human beings. It is for Cartesians what sets human beings apart from automata. Autonomous mechanisms, therefore, might be a contradiction in terms for Cartesians, but not necessarily for us. Sometimes, for us, autonomous mechanisms are taken to be autonomous insofar as they are self-moving, that is to say, insofar as they are automata. But sometimes autonomous mechanisms are taken to be autonomous insofar as they may or may not be self-moving, but which are in other respects independent, independently recognizing, sorting, processing, navigating, reacting. It's this subset of autonomous mechanisms that is particularly interesting. This class of tasks, recognizing, sorting, processing, reacting, and so on, can be broadly construed as information processing, as juxtaposed with movement. It's like the difference between an automata, that is, a self-moving mechanical arm, and a machine that is a self-moving mechanical arm that moves chess pieces according to chess rules in a display of respectable play. These autonomous mechanisms, mechanisms for doing information-based tasks, are autonomous to the degree that they don't require information-based interventions from humans, insofar as they don't need human know-how, what, where, when, or why for a particular function. For these mechanisms, autonomy is constructed on a loosely mental set of criteria, without necessarily appealing to a substance dualism of minds. Instead, the criteria is mental in the sense of being knowledge or information rather than materially based. For the class of mechanism concerned with information processing, to be autonomous is therefore predicated on a persistent appeal to what humans do. And here we can easily end up circling back to classic questions. Are autonomous mechanisms for information processing tasks just doing what humans do? What would it mean to characterize human knowledge and information processing as the machinations of an autonomous mechanism? I'll end this with an observation. If a conniving Turker were to label a vast swath of images of socks with the string CAT, a machine trained on those images would be none the wiser. Not because it doesn't have the relevant recognition functionality, but because the system doesn't know anything about cats or socks, or for that matter about words or images. But what does it mean to know about the connection between CAT and words, images, ideas of cats, or cats in the world anyway? There's a lot more to be said on this general topic, and admittedly, this last point is a Pandora's box of philosophical intrigue that is simply beyond the scope of this already very long video. In any case, there are all kinds of issues related to autonomy in humans and machines. Questions about whether human beings are aptly described as automata. Questions about whether some AI systems are aptly described as automata. We could discuss the moral status of automata, insofar as moral status is predicated in part on notions of autonomy. We could take a deeper dive into the social, political, environmental, and cultural dimensions of ideas of autonomy. What I hope you do take away from this, though, is some background and perhaps foundational knowledge from which to informedly interrogate the ascriptions of autonomy and identifications of automata, which are so often made in modern popular discourse and academic literature on AI. In what sense do we take extant systems to be autonomous? And does this track with what we take autonomy to be? Are we in fact operating with multiple notions of autonomy? Perhaps one set of rules for artificial mechanisms and another for human beings? I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this in the Q&A session for week 7.
The inner machinations of my mind are an enigma.